Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mad in America. On MIA Today, we published an article where a group of scholars are advocating that we must look at psychedelics through a humanities approach instead of a medicalized one. This ties in perfectly with the conversation we will have, because in the spotlight today, we have Rose Cartwright, author of Pure, a hugely successful book, which was then turned into a series. I encountered Rose's work through a recent Guardian article that was titled, I was the poster girl for OCD, then I began to question everything I'd been told about mental illness. And it caught my attention immediately for its very personal and nuanced look into OCD and diagnosis and psychedelics, trauma, and most importantly, relationality. All of that is what we will discuss today. Rose, welcome to Mad in America.
Hi, IOD. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
You wrote Pure, which was about your experience with intrusive thoughts, right? OCD was the diagnosis that you received. Then it was turned into a series for Channel 4. And at one point, you were a huge advocate for, the medical model of understanding human suffering because it made sense. But since then, things shifted. And you write that you were confronted with information and experiences that challenged this understanding. First, could you tell us briefly about your struggle with intrusive thoughts?
When I was around 15 years old, I started experiencing very vivid, graphic, intrusive thoughts of a sexual and violent and harm-related nature. And these intrusions, it was language, it was mental images. They started coming into my mind almost nonstop, hundreds of times a day. And they were profoundly terrifying to me and profoundly shameful. I was a teenager. The content was deeply disturbing to me, and I didn't tell anybody about it because I was so ashamed. This continued for several years into my late adolescence and into my 20s, and there were other problems that went alongside the intrusive thoughts. There was self-harm, there was bulimia, lots of control behaviors, a great deal of anxiety, suicidal ideation. I was in a really, really, really difficult place. And I was searching for answers. I didn't understand my experiences and I was lost. And in my early 20s, I started to Google intrusive thoughts and try to find out if there were people out there that were experiencing the same thing as me. Of course, the big fear when you have intrusive thoughts is that you're the only person in the world that feels like this. And I did that, and I realized that intrusive thoughts are a common symptom reported by people with OCD. And I started reading around obsessive compulsive disorder, and it seemed to fit so well. Most people think of a kind of a sort of, in quotes, kind of like classic kind of OCD as sort of, scrupulosity or like obsessive like cleaning of tabletops to get rid of germs and things like that. And what I was learning in that early reading that I was doing was that that kind of compulsive behavior can also occur in the form of like mental rumination or like compulsive like checking of somatic experiences. For example, like, raking over the content of your dreams to try and mine it for information about who you think you really are. There's just a few examples, but it all seemed to make a great deal of sense to me. And alongside these revelations came this sort of medical framing of the whole experience. So, not only did I now have language, obsessions and compulsions, but also a psychiatric diagnosis and a whole set of assumptions as well. So that, OCD is something that is experienced by hundreds of thousands or millions of people around the world, which it certainly is, but also that this is a brain-based problem, that it is caused by organic problems in the brains, and that it can be explained by theories of neural circuitry and serotonin imbalance, and that targeted medications and therapies can help with those symptoms. So the whole framework was illness. And I bought into it. And as you said in your introduction, in my book, Pure, and then in the subsequent TV show, Pure, I wrote about the phenomenology of my suffering, about the experience of intrusive thoughts and internal compulsions, and that resonated with people a great deal. But what I was also promoting was this sort of medical way of seeing my problems. That I thought that my OCD had arisen sort of spontaneously when I was a teenager. Like the symptoms of a cold, the kind of illness that anybody can get. Mm-hmm. Completely decontextualized from my life. And it's a story that didn't serve me for very long, let's put it that way.
Long. That makes sense. Once we're provided with a meaningful framework that also gives us language, and then also a causal explanation for why this is happening, and then also some kind of a hope for alleviation of suffering. You say that you use this model, this whole framing, but eventually you began to rethink this understanding of human distress. Could you tell us, like, what was it? What happened that made you go, wait, this is not serving me, or wait, what is happening? Maybe I don't completely buy into it anymore.
There was a series of catalysts which contributed to the shifting of my worldview. And the first part of The Maps We Carry is an exploration of all those different catalysts and essentially how I came to be disillusioned with the medical model. It was an intellectual shift, but also an emotional shift. The most blatant thing was that I realized that I wasn't getting better, that the diagnostic model had provided relief, but it had been temporary, and that discovering other people out there that also had OCD had been extremely nourishing to me, and almost like a life raft, but that also, like, in the long run, my problems kept returning, and that cyclically I kept on how I characterized it at the time was I kept on relapsing. This illness kept on coming back. So there was a sense that, like, I'm not actually sure that the model that I've bought into here is really getting to the heart of what's wrong for me. But I was able to essentially sort of repress a lot of those doubts. There wasn't really anybody out there in my circle that was kind of questioning this way of seeing. So I sort of ignored it for a while until it really became unignorable. And another catalyst was more of a sort of a cognitive intellectual one. I went to Trinity College Dublin for a podcast interview to interview a neuroscientist there called Dr. Claire Gillen. She's a professor, she's brilliant. And she explained to me that OCD isn't a biological reality. And when I heard that phrase in her office, I really bristled. That was a very difficult thing for me to hear, because my whole sense of identity was built around the idea that OCD is a biological phenomena that is distinct from people who've got depression or anorexia or generalized anxiety disorder. That was the definition of the problem that I shared with all the other people who had the same diagnosis. And it was distressing to me. And then I spoke to Claire longer, and I went away and did lots of reading, and I sort of started to understand that what she was saying is she's not saying that OCD isn't happening at a level of the brain. Like, of course it is. When my OCD was at its worst, if you'd looked at my brain, I'm sure you would have seen like neural correlates that correlated with my distress. It's absolutely real. But what she was saying is that it's a construct, and that there actually aren't biomarkers that distinguish DSM diagnoses. And that was like news to me. I didn't know that. I thought that the DSM was a manual that was based on biological data. So that was a real moment of like the scales falling from my eyes, and me realizing that actually I was very mistaken about a lot of my assumptions about what we know about mental health and what we don't. And it sort of set me off on a path of reading and conversations, a 7-year process of like trying to get my head around, like, well, what do we actually mean when we talk about mental health problems? What do we know? What don't we know? And I came to various conclusions, but one of the conclusions I came to is actually that mental health problems are incredibly mysterious, and that we actually know much less about the brain that I think a lot of people in the mental health advocacy space realize.
You said a couple of really important things. This idea that people have that if it's not biological, it can't be serious or real, right? And it's something that I have to teach my students. About this idea about, diagnosis having this biological reality, and the fact that people in the psychiatry community pretend that, of course, everyone knows that. So before anything else, tell me about this experience of disillusionment, right? You talked about how diagnosis, a huge part of it was your identity, and it happens to most people, becomes attached to it and molded by it. And then to have the scales fall off your eyes, as you said, what was the experience like of disillusionment?
I mean, it was quite a lonely one, really, because I spent like several years, becoming very bedded in as an OCD advocate, and that community is founded on a set of assumptions about what mental health problems are, and it's a very biomedical worldview, and I didn't see that there was much space for another way of seeing the problem of obsessions and compulsions. Yeah, it was extremely challenging.
Right. So we're going to go down one layer, just one there right now, right? Which is the exploration of trauma. And for your own self, you found that the trauma model and childhood, extreme stress explained a lot of your suffering. So tell us about what you found helpful about this view that your OCD was partly caused by early childhood stress.
I generally subscribe to a kind of like a sort of a trauma-informed approach to mental health problems. And when I started doing high-dose psychedelics, which we can talk about, what emerged from those experiences very quickly was a very sort of crystal clear realization that had always sort of been lurking in my peripheral vision, in the peripheral vision of my consciousness, but actually had never really looked at directly before. And that's that my severe mental health problems were probably influenced by the fact that my mom was severely depressed throughout my childhood, had been given a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and was repeatedly being admitted into psychiatric hospital. So when I was at home, as you can imagine, there's a sort of almost a constant level of ambient chaos. And I saw and heard a lot of distressing things when I was very, very young and into my teens and 20s. So, and it sort of at that level, it makes sense that that a young psyche would have to go to quite extreme lengths to manage the stress associated with that situation. And, it's 5 years on now since I first sort of like really grasped that about myself, and that understanding has kind of remained stable. I still think that is a very, it's simple, but it's also, it really makes sense to me.
You have also kind of talked about that there are certain problems if we adhere to the trauma model too rigidly, right? Or the way it's often utilized, which is a focus on this singular lens of trauma or this event. I remember you said sometimes looking only at trauma can be a barrier in seeing the role systemic factors have to play in our distress, right? So could you talk a little bit about the issues with the trauma model that you also realized existed if used badly? And what were the systemic factors that you realized, were important in your suffering?
I think, I write about in my book that I think sometimes the trauma model can be a little bit too focused on single issues, and it can sort of hold a magnifying glass over childhood relationships, as important as and influential as I think they are, without looking at the broader context in which those relationships are nested. My mom's distress was impacted by everything else that was going on around her. My dad, my dad was out of work, and I was raised on benefits, and there was a huge amount of financial stress. The school system was very poor, and my brother had a lot of behavioral and learning difficulties, and he was not being supported. So, in one sense, you could say that my distress was caused by having a difficult relationship with mom as a result of her illness. But in another sense, you could say that like my distress is actually reactive to a much broader set of social, national, even international stresses. So I think the trauma model can be slightly limiting if it turns our parents or our caregivers into pawns in simplistic, like psychological stories, in simplistic ideas of cause and effect, because it's just never simple.
So we now come to your experience with psychedelics, but kind of before that, your first sort of experience with an alternate state. right? Or an
Yeah.
altered state, which was not psychedelic induced. So let's
Mhm.
get into that story. Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
We were talking about this shift that occurred for me in terms of like the way I saw mental health problems, the emotional shift, the intellectual shift. Part of that, around the same time, I got into Vipassana meditation for the first time. I was, as I said, looking for answers. I was desperate. My OCD had relapsed. I couldn't believe I was back at square one, having published a book and having a TV show that had told my redemption story, and to still be suffering in the way that I was unbearable to me. And in search of relief, I decided that I wanted to explore meditation as a sort of, as a kind of salve. It was one road that I hadn't walked down yet. And I dived in at the deep end and went on a 10-day silent meditation retreat in California. I was so naive and green at the time. I didn't realize that it was significant that the retreat was held by Joseph Goldstein, who's obviously a giant in that first wave of people who brought meditation back from the East and Central Asia. I essentially didn't know how lucky I was. But yeah, a retreat hosted by Joseph Goldstein. The first 3 days of that retreat were hell on earth. When you've got intrusive thoughts that loop in your mind hundreds of times a day, like sitting with those thoughts is a very challenging thing to do, to say the least. And on day 3, something very, very interesting started to happen in that I essentially started to have what I can only describe as an altered state of consciousness. And I had never taken psychedelics at the time, but I essentially had a sort of hour and a half, 2 hour long experience of like non-duality, white lights, feeling like the boundaries of my body was eroding and like blending with the cosmos, a sense of like overwhelming love, a sort of an impersonal love that extended to all beings. And my mind was absolutely blown by this. It was the first time in 15 years that I had been like liberated from intrusive thoughts. And it also didn't really fit with my understanding of mental health problems at the time, which was that I had a disease. So in the wake of this experience, I'm sat there thinking like, A, like what the hell was that? I hadn't taken any drugs, like didn't know that those kind of states were possible. And like B, like if I've got a disease, how can the symptoms of disease just spontaneously subside for a couple of hours and then return? And as I said, that was around the time that I went to Trinity College Dublin and spoke to Claire Gillen. And things just started to kind of coalesce for me, like insights around like, okay, well, there's more to know here about my conscious experience than the diagnostic model had offered me.
Thank you. So that's where psychedelics enter now, right? Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What has been your experience with psychedelics and what have they offered you?
I got very curious about psychedelics because of the altered state of consciousness that I'd had in California. And I started reading around studies that had been done on altered states of consciousness in meditators. And there seemed to be a lot of overlap between, the brains of experienced meditators and the brains of people who are post like high dose psychedelics. And that was, I got very curious about that. And that was what led me down the path of starting to speak to psychedelic healers and neuroscientists, psychedelic researchers about like what was actually going on like during the psychedelic experience. Why is it so strange? Why is it so mystical? This was 2017, 2018. It was kind of like just a few years into the psychedelic renaissance. There was a huge amount of hype, a huge amount of excitement about the potential of these drugs to transform people with very serious mental health problems. And, because I was still suffering terribly, I thought, well, maybe this is something that I need to explore, and maybe there's more to know about my mind. I felt like in California, I'd kind of like glimpsed behind the curtain of like a version of existence that was possible, like beyond the misery that I'd been locked in for 15 years. And I wondered if there might be other routes into that place. So I did a couple of years research into clinical trials, into psychedelic therapy. And I decided to take the plunge and do a high dose of psilocybin magic mushrooms, which I did in Amsterdam with a couple of guides. And it was that trip which kind of like really blew the doors off the medical model for me in terms of the way that I saw my mental health problems. In that trip, I had the experience of like watching my mom, the sort of the essence of my mother kind of get sucked into a giant black hole in the sky. And I was just sobbing and begging her not to leave me here alone with this pain. And I came away like realizing that was pain that had been lurking under the surface of my experience since I was a little kid.
I do want to talk about people's expectations. So as psychedelics become this big thing and their medicalization becomes bigger and they get more popular in terms of this, great next neat magic trick to fix mental illness, right? As this is happening, you write about people can go into therapeutic psychedelic experiences with expectations, like I will find my trauma, right? And then they might cling too tightly to a story and it becomes like this really fixed identity. And that, you write, is kind of problematic. If somebody were listening right now, what, according to you, would be a good state of mind for someone to have when they enter a therapeutic psychedelic experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a good point in that, like, we've been talking about how the medical model can be a little bit rigid in terms of how people are encouraged to think about their mental health problems. I think the trauma model can also be a little bit rigid, and like often the framing of psychedelic experiences like is that you're going in to explore your trauma, and you're gonna feel all the pain that you repressed when you were a little kid, and that you're gonna release that pain, and that you're gonna come out and feeling better. And again, I just think that can be a little bit simplistic. The thing is with psychedelic experiences is that they tend to surprise you. It can be a good idea to kind of let go of any assumptions of what you're going to find and really surrender to the unknown and surrender to uncertainty. I write in my book about there's a Zen Buddhist concept of like Shoshin, like they talk about like beginner's mind, trying to let go of any preconceptions and expectations of an end result. And I think that's actually very important. And it's also, it's important in terms of going into an experience, but it's also important in terms of integrating experiences afterwards. Because if you go in with the expectation that everything that comes up in your trip is, to be interpreted literally, that you can run into problems there as well, because some of these experiences are extremely esoteric, often very metaphorical. So you might have something that feels like a memory, but perhaps isn't. And ultimately, all this stuff is, it's very difficult to navigate if you're trying to arrive at an objective truth about what's happened to you. So that I think, the phrase that I come back to again and again in the Mats We Carry is like just like trying to like hold conclusions lightly with love, but lightly, and to, use any conclusions that you come to about your psychedelic experiences to the extent to which they're helpful, but then don't let those things calcify and become part of your identity. That, because you don't want to walk around like a traumatized person, like you just want to be reborn in each moment. That's the whole Buddhist philosophy.
That was probably one of my most favorite things. I remember you writing about it as walking into the experience gently. And also when you do the integration, you do it gently. You write about some of your worries about the way psychedelics are getting used or, co-opted by bigger industries. Would you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of do an exercise in my book where I speculate, like, had psychedelic therapy been available to my mother when she was at her worst, like, would it have been helpful? And, as I said, my mom had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. She was spending like months at a time in bed, sobbing at the dinner table, crying at night. It's just sometimes like catatonic, unable to experience her life, let alone enjoy it. And, throwing a psychedelic experience into the mix for someone like that, potentially, and there's a whole other conversation, by the way, about like certain contraindications for like taking psychedelics. Like generally people who've been given a diagnosis of bipolar disorder don't qualify for clinical trials, but don't really want to get into that. But, if my mom had access to that kind of therapy, would it have helped? And I think on some level, yes, because I genuinely do, as we're looking at this stuff through a critical lens, it's also important to keep saying that I genuinely do think psychedelics are like really helpful tools for exploring trauma. So to some extent, I think it would have been helpful, but after the trip, she would still have come back to the stress of like trying to feed a family of six on low income and benefits.
Right.
She would still have been isolated. My dad would still have been out of work. And my concern with the medicalization and industrialization of psychedelics, and that these very profound experiences being turned into protocols and interventions, is that they don't actually address the social determinants of distress.
Right.
That, in my opinion, lead to a huge amount of trauma in the first place. And it's not a case of either or. Like, we can edge the psychedelics conversation forward, and also talk about things like the need for policy change. But I don't really see, psychedelics are a very like middle class phenomenon. These psychedelic protocols are like generally like engaged with by and designed by middle class people. Psychiatry is traditionally a very conservative institution, so I just don't see many voices out there, many people advocating for the sort of the broader concerns of our mental health crisis and what actually genuinely needs to change at a foundational systemic level if we really want to see an end to our mental health crisis.
So in the beginning, you talked about, realizing that there were multiple layers to this. And we kind of went through the layer of trauma and then psychedelics. And we wrote kind of what appears to be one of the most important bottom ones, which is relationality. And towards the end in your book, one of the final realizations seemed to be that psychedelics were important, but it was eventually about community. That something about community that really helped as you had your main experience with others, right? So tell us about this, what you found about the place and the importance of others in this whole process of, let's say, healing.
I had a couple of very powerful psilocybin journeys, one in combination with MDMA, what's known as a hippie flip, and another big 5-gram mushroom journey. And one way to conceptualize like how those experiences were healing to me is like the way they changed my brain, and they certainly did. And that's an important piece to have on the table. Another way to conceptualize how they were painful is because during those experiences, I was able to re-experience and let go of repressed emotion related to my traumatic past. And another way to think about it is that I went into those experiences and was able, because I worked with guides and I worked in a group, I was able to like fully let down my defenses in front of other human beings for the first time during the experience. And then afterwards, I was able to sit and be extremely vulnerable with people who cared, people who could be relied upon, and people who would be there for me in the following weeks. So where the healing comes from, that's a really complex question. But I think that last part is as important as the rest. And really the insight I came to at the end of the book, and I don't want to say at the end of the journey because it's always ongoing, but is that every psychiatric psychological intervention really counts for nothing unless we're really held in trusting, loving relationships. And I think that's really what our hearts are crying out for. That's what beats under every mental health problem, is that we want to feel safe, we want to feel loved. And the way that we live, it just so often gets in the way of that really core need. And what's been interesting is that, one of the things that came up a lot for me in these psychedelic experiences was like loneliness. Like a desperate feeling of like, oh, there's no one coming. And there's no one that I could reach out to in my distress right now. And I think that was a harkening back to like real desolation and loneliness I felt as a kid. But what was interesting for me as sort of coming out of those psychedelic experiences, that in a way, and my mental health is much, much better, like dramatically better now than it ever was. And I put that largely down to psychedelics. But in another way, psychedelics kind of opened up another wound in that the loneliness, I think actually it's kind of appropriate to be lonely in the world that we live in right now. And psychedelics didn't solve any of the conditions of modern life that I think contribute to our loneliness. The fact that we live in a consumer society, the fact that we're atomized from the people that we love from other generations, the fact that we don't live in community. So, the next layer down for me is actually like sort of kind of like dealing with that existential loneliness and treating it with tenderness, and also not expecting it to go away. Like, it's not don't consider it a mental health problem to feel lonely when I live in London, and I'm working too much to spend time with the people that I love in a way that like feeds my need for social nourishment. I don't think that I think that's normal, and I think it's natural, which is a bittersweet realization. I think, you know, one of the concepts that I explore in the book, which I found very helpful, is from a psychiatrist called Bruce Perry. He wrote a book with Oprah called What Happened to You? And he talks about relational poverty. So that a lot of people in the West, we have a huge amount of privilege and relative like political stability compared to a lot of the world. And, you know, it's really important to keep that front of mind. But also, we paid a really high price for our financial stability, you know, where we used to have strong communities, we now have strong markets. And I think most of us have just normalized isolation, and psychedelics can be a tool to become disillusioned with a lot of the facets of modern life. And that can be difficult. So I think, you know, that's another thing. Yeah. It can be challenged in ways you didn't expect.
So we're going to change gears here, okay? Very, very strongly, because there is this thing that I want to talk about. I think it's really important. Joanna Moncrief's article, right? More than a year ago, and of course, Moncrief and her colleagues, this huge umbrella review came out and talked about how the serotonin theory of depression was bust. And I remember after that, the many psychiatric experts who scoffed at it, saying, well, of course, we've known about this for so long. You wrote that there is a huge gap amongst this expert reaction to her article that, oh, well, you know, we of course know serotonin theory is not what it is.
Yeah.
And that of the actual people in public. Because we have this idea, oh, we completely adhere to the biopsychosocial model, but in real life, in practice, things are very different. I want you to speak a little bit about how things are, you know, on ground with people in real life.
It's interesting, like when that Joanna Moncrief article came out, and the reaction that I've had to some of my thoughts and feelings from psychiatrists, I've encountered a certain kind of like dismissiveness along the lines of like, well, of course no one believes in the serotonin theory of depression anymore. Like, of course no one thinks that it's as simple as a chemical imbalance. Like, why are you even talking about this stuff? You're just knocking down a straw man. And I'm sat there thinking, well, hang on a second, like, you guys in your ivory towers might have figured out the nuances, but like these simple stories were disseminated by the psychiatric industry because they were profitable over decades. And the vast majority of the public still buy into them and still buy into the products of that industry. So I spend like 2 chapters of the book trying to like reconcile that gap, because it's like, it seems that like the psychiatric community is just like claims to have moved on to a biopsychosocial approach. But actually, in terms of the stories that are out there in the ether, like most people on the street, as you know, they still think that, you know, someone with depression still thinks that like their depression is caused by a spontaneous like malfunction in their brain. And like, you know, I don't know, I'm sort of at a little bit of a loss as to how the psych professionals can be so dismissive of ideas that people who went before them put out into the world. And I think it's their responsibility to provide the corrective. And the corrective is not just rolling out some new explanatory model. It's not like it's all about trauma. Or it's all about gut health. The necessary corrective is like, actually, it's way more complicated than we initially said. We actually know very, very little about the brain. But what we do know is that the brain reacts to the environment, and that people's emotional health reacts to environmental conditions. Like, that is not a controversial thing to say. So, yeah, as you can probably tell, like that's been quite a frustrating conversation for me to have, because I think there's a duty of care that is not being done.
So I told you I did this report for Mad in America, this conference that I attended here in India. And the whole conference, this huge psychiatric conference, was about a public health approach, about structural determinants of mental health. For 3 days, that's all we talked about. It sounded amazing and fantastic. And that was the beauty of the conference. I loved it. But when it came down to, there was just no conversation about treatments or interventions. There was no conversation. And when I asked, like, you know, one of the main speakers, privately. I was like, okay, we've been talking about this, but what do we do? So, let's say all these farmers are committing suicide because of all of these structural things. What do we do about that? And he was like, well, antidepressants have shown some promise. And I just wanted to pull my hair out. Like, really, you talk for 3 days about structural determinants of mental health and then come back down to let's shove a pill down this farmer's throat because climate change and money lending policy and corporate this thing has made his life miserable and he can't feed anyone and he's killing himself. Let's put a pill down his throat. So I know there is a huge conversation around structural determinants. I just don't know if it translates to practice when it comes to interventions.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of the problem is that, I think medicine has a very, very, very important and quite small role to play in the mental health of the most seriously mentally unwell. I do think that it's important to say that. But actually, it's not really the kind of like structural and policy changes we're talking about, the more holistic stuff. It's not really actually a doctor's job to do any of that. So what we're really talking about is like walking back the purview of psychiatry. So no one's incentivized to do that. And, there's been admirable efforts like, the idea of like social prescribing, that you could go to the doctor and the doctor could basically give you a directive to go and like join a social club or join a sports team. And like, that makes sense. But really, I mean, you don't need a medical degree to do that. Like we've had that knowledge about how to live in community in our bones forever.
My last question is kind of a comment more than anything else. And this is the pattern I found in the book. And it's, you wrote about, the biomedical model and the trauma model, use of psychedelics in therapy. And at every point, you also talked about their limitations. Like everything reduced to personal trauma might limit a person's ability to see larger systems at play, right? Psychedelics, great experience, can be co-opted. At the same time, I remember you said, we should not be fear-mongering about psychedelics either, and that's important. Mm-hmm. So there is a very thoughtful, careful, and nuanced take about all of these things, right? And I want to know, how did you reach this? Like, because I find it absent in so many places. It's always, I have the solution, but this is the new thing. So how did you reach such a complex and nuanced understanding of these, let's call them instruments of healing, methods of healing, or whatever?
I think my meditation practice has been very instrumental for me. Meditating is not just about wellness, about feeling better. It's also about learning how to think and learning how and realizing like how we get attached to our thoughts and we get attached to ideas, and then that they bed in and become part of your identity. And I've been lucky to be taught by some amazing Buddhist teachers. And one thing that they all have in common is that they just tread very softly with ideas. And I've found that very inspiring, is that they're constantly encouraging you to think critically about your own assumptions, and to, even if something feels really true and really solid, just like stay with that and see if it changes. And I think one thing that characterizes, the harmful practices as I see them in psychiatry and psychology for the past several decades, it is a sort of, it's an imposition of a simple story rather than a facilitation of like self-inquiry. So you go to the doctor and you're offered a simple solution. And I just didn't want to contribute to that. And I see the same thing in trauma narratives of mental health. It's like, well, everything that you feel is about, your relationship with your dad or your relationship with your mom, and none of this is sufficient. And I think, really what was helpful to me is just try and foster a kind of cognitive flexibility, and to not try and like strong arm any idea over the line. Actually just say like, just try and cultivate uncertainty, because I'm guilty of being dogmatic in the past, and of not being critical enough. And I don't want to make the same mistakes again.
All right. Thank you so much, Rose, for this. And thank you for coming here and having this conversation with us.
Thank you, IAD.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.